What's up again, YouTube? Here we go. So in the last video, I went over the idea of collectivism and individualism, and then we quickly, sort of quickly in 30 minutes, ran through the desire for change, liberals, conservatives, radical, revolutionary, reactionary, and what they view society as and what they want to do with society, right? Where they want to go with society. And I said that in a subsequent video, we would have a look at the economic and the political spectrum. So I'm going to keep this one up here. Keep it in mind that up above on the left, we have collectivism. Up above on the right, we have individualism. And that, please understand, everything on this sheet is collectivist or individualist, right? So anything on the left side, so radical, revolutionary, liberal, socialism, communism, they're all collectivist ideologies or collectivist in nature, right? And everything on the right, conservatism, capitalism, corporatism, fascism, reactionaryism, and these two are kind of different, and we'll talk about that, are mainly individualist in nature. Conservatism and capitalism for sure, but you could make an argument for reactionaryism and also corporatism having elements of individualism in it as well. Okay, with that being said, guys, we're going to talk about the economic spectrum. And the economic spectrum, guys, is these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms right here, right? Communism, socialism, mixed economy, capitalism, and corporatism / fascism, okay? So, economics. Let's talk about economics for a second. Economics, guys, is the study of something called scarcity. When something is scarce, it means there's not a lot of it. It means there's not enough to go around. Now, every economic system, whether it is a leftist economic system or more of a rightist economic system, has to answer the 3 questions of economics. And those 3 questions are what to produce, for whom to produce it for, and then how do we distribute or allocate, 3 fingers, how do we distribute or allocate those goods or services? So what do we produce? How do we, or for whom do we make it for? And then how do we distribute or allocate those resources? And depending upon if you have an economic system that is more on the left or the right, will help us understand the nature of that economic system. More leftist economic systems believe that those questions should be answered by government intervention. And on the right, especially with capitalism, they believe that government should have very little to do with the economic system, and it should be, a new term for you here, it should be laissez-faire, which means let it be, let it go, leave it alone, right? I've seen a number of different translations of the idea of laissez-faire, but basically means government should butt out of the economy, and that's capitalism for you, right? And then again, we'll talk about the far right with corporatism and fascism, and really, how are these 2 economic systems beside each other? I mean, fascism, that's a dictatorship. Like, how could that be next to capitalism? We'll talk about that. All right, so much like last time, folks, what we did is we looked at the left first, right? We looked at the left side of the spectrum first in the last video, and we're going to do the same with that here because it just kind of makes sense in my mind. Okay, now, to the left side of the economic spectrum, we find this ideology called socialism, right? And when I think socialism, I think of Scandinavian nations like Sweden, like Norway, like Denmark, right? Those are 3 great examples that you could use on your diploma exam should the assignment number 1 or assignment number 2 possibly lead you down the road towards socialism, or even the assignment number 3 if you're in 30-2, right? So anyways, guys, socialism is an economic system. It's not a political system, right? It is an economic system. It's all about allocating those scarce resources. And essentially, guys, what socialism wants to do is it wants to create, big idea for you here, economic equality, okay? Take a second, write that down. Socialism wants to create economic equality. What the heck is economic equality, Mr. Crosby? Well, I'll tell you. Economic equality is a situation where there's rich people and then poor people, and that gap between them, right? That economic disparity is lessened, or ideally, everyone economically is the same. There's no rich, there's no poor anymore. In hardcore socialist states like the former Soviet Union, they really tried to achieve that goal of economic equality. In more moderate socialist states like in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, how we achieve that economic equality is through redistribution of wealth, or as we sometimes call it, taxation. We take from the rich, we give to the poor, right? That is what we do. Okay, with that being said, guys, in a socialist society, we tend to see a lot of government regulation or intervention in the economy. The government regulates or intervenes in most industry, and they do it for the greater good of the collective. And this is why we find socialism under the banner up here of collectivism. So in socialist states, the decisions that governments make as far as the regulation of business in the economy is to try to promote this idea of economic equality. So they own or they regulate many, many businesses in the name of, as it mentions here, public interest. So quite often, guys, here in Social 30, what we're going to do is we sort of dichotomize this idea of public versus private ownership. And in a socialist nation, as we move from the middle to more of the left, in a socialist nation, it's like, 75, 80%, 70%, 90% government-owned or regulated industry. There's a lot of regulation in those nations. However, if you know anything about Sweden or Norway or Denmark and the nations of Scandinavia, right? Iceland's included in there usually too. You know that there is still some private ownership, right? Case in point, IKEA, right? IKEA is an example of a Swedish company that has done very well for itself, right? They're worldwide now. And the Swedish government doesn't own IKEA, but they'll take a lot of taxes from them. There's a lot of regulation on IKEA. And as a result, guys, again, that mix of public and private ownership in a socialist nation, it's more so public than it is private. You don't have a free market in a socialist nation. You just don't, okay? And as it says, the private sector is quite small. Private sector meaning private ownership, where the government doesn't get involved in the day-to-day operations of a business. It's very, very small, okay? Now, moving from the left of center position on the economic spectrum all the way to the far left. As we move further to the left, the desire to achieve economic equality, right? Everyone being economically the same in order to produce utopia is more heavily desired. So, guys, if socialism is like a lot of government regulation and ownership of industry, when we move to communism, we see total government regulation and ownership of industry. It is total, okay? So with that being said, guys, all economic decisions in a communist nation are planned by government. So what to produce, who to produce it for, and how we distribute it, those three questions are totally answered by government. There is no free market. There is no private ownership. All of the economy is run and controlled by the government. And when we talked about radical or revolutionary societies before, we mentioned North Korea, we mentioned Cuba, we mentioned the Soviet Union, and those nations also employ communism as their economic system. There is no private ownership in those nations. When the Cuban Revolution happened in the late 1950s and Fidel Castro and his cadres took over the island of Cuba, they nationalized all business. Nationalized means they had it become controlled by government. And the idea of nationalization is a very important term for you here in Social 30. So nationalization means when government runs business. And, you know, in a country like Canada, we might see some nationalization of industry, right? Like Canada Post is still a nationalized service here in Canada, but we're getting away from that. However, in places like North Korea, Cuba, Soviet Union, the economy is totally nationalized. So all economic decisions are centrally planned. Sometimes you'll hear a communist economy be referred to as a centrally planned economy. Central planned economy or centrally planned economy and communism are synonymous with each other. They mean the same thing. If you hear the term centrally planned economy, that is communism. Okay, on the diploma exam, especially for you 30-2s, they typically don't use the term communism, but they will use the term centrally planned economy in your assignment number 1. And you need to be able to clue in and be like, oh yeah, okay, that's just communism. And if you understand communism, then the assignment number 1 is very, very easy. So it says the means of production are controlled by the state. So in a communist society, the means of production, land, labor, and capital, right? The things that you need in order to produce a product or a service are totally controlled by government. And again, dichotomizing it with socialism here in the left of center position, not the far left position like communism. In a socialist economy, the means of production are mostly controlled by government. But again, there's still that element of private ownership. And depending upon what country you're in, whether it's Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Iceland, depending upon what country you're in, you'll see a different blend of government control of industry and then also free market. But there's a lot of it in all socialist nations. But again, as you get into communist nations, you see total government ownership. All right, so that's the left side of the economic spectrum. And again, guys, the goal of all leftist economic systems is to create economic equality. That's what they want to achieve, right? Now, let's move to the left side of the spectrum. Let's talk about capitalism. Capitalism is a pretty easy economic system to put your finger on. Capitalism is often juxtaposed with socialism. We look at these two things as opposites, okay? And if socialism sees government control, then capitalism sees a lack of government control. In a true capitalist society, right? Going back to like Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, back in 1776, Adam Smith, he said the greatest way to create prosperity is to have the people do it for themselves. And that incorporates the idea of laissez-faire, right? That let it be, let it go, leave it alone type of economy. When people work for themselves, they tend to work very, very hard. So in a capitalist economic system, we see a lack of government control. Ideally, we see none. Now, the best example of a capitalist society in the world today would be the United States of America. Now, while the United States of America might not be a true capitalist society because there is some government regulation, right? The United States definitely likes to think of itself as a free market economy. Now, when it comes to that dichotomy of public versus private ownership, again, socialism seeing lots of public ownership or total in the case of communism. In the case of capitalism, we see no public ownership and it's total private ownership. So when we looked at communism, we talked about the means of production, right? Land, labor, capital. In a communist society, land, labor, capital is all controlled and regulated and nationalized and owned by government. However, in a capitalist society, what we have is the means of production, land, labor, capital, being owned and controlled by individuals for their own profit. Because again, guys, Adam Smith figured out way back in 1776, right? Or before that, when he wrote his The Wealth of Nations, right? Or an inquiry into the nature, into the wealth of nations, right? When Smith wrote that book back in 1776, when he published it, what Smith figured out, guys, Smith basically wanted to know, why are some nations rich and some nations poor? And what's the best way to create prosperity in society? And Smith figured out that it is the nations that have the freest economies that tend to see the most prosperity. And it makes sense, guys. Think about this for a sec. In a socialist society, your labor, the work that you do, goes to benefit not you, but other people. In a capitalist society, your work, the sweat from your brow, right, that you're engaged in, that work is to benefit you and you only. And you decide what you do with the fruits of your labor, right? If you're a capitalist and you plant an apple tree, and your tree produces 100 buckets of apples, you get to keep those 100 buckets of apples and do whatever you want with it. Whereas in a socialist society, right, if you have a tree that is owned by government, and the government and that tree, produces 100 buckets of apples, well, you might get to keep 20 because you tended to that tree, you helped maintain it and stuff like that. You get to keep 20, but the government takes 80 and then doles those apples out to everybody else. So there's a fundamental difference between socialism and capitalism. So in a capitalist society, guys, private enterprise, not public enterprise. Public enterprise is where government owns industry, right? In the name of the greater good. In a true capitalist society, there is no public ownership. And the means of production, as I mentioned, are privately controlled. Land, labor, capital are in the hands of individuals. And the public sector is very, very small, right? What government owns, that's what the public sector is very, very small. Ideally, in a true theoretic capitalist society, it would be non-existent. Okay, now let's move to the far right, and then we'll talk about the mixed economy. Okay, so the corporatist or fascist economic system. The first thing we have to understand, guys, is how could capitalism and fascism be beside each other? And the answer to that question is, in both societies, there are elements of private ownership, or at least in the case of fascism or corporatism, mostly private ownership. The state doesn't look to own the means of production, but what they want in a corporatist or fascist society is harmony between business interests and government, right? Business and government are to be, it's to be a symbiotic relationship, to use a biological term here. It should be a symbiotic relationship between business and government. And private property is allowed and it's encouraged. Now, why? Why do fascist states encourage private property ownership? Well, guys, everything that happens in a fascist state is to make the state stronger, okay? It's to improve it militarily. It's to improve it economically, right? Fascist states, their number one goal is strength. And fascist individuals figured out that when you allow individuals to own the means of production and kind of work for themselves, I put that in quotes because they're not really working for themselves. There's still state oversight, but nonetheless, if you're that factory owner who's getting like a good benefit from being the owner of that factory, you're going to work harder. You're going to make better business decisions. And as a result, the economy is going to be stronger. A strong economy leads to a strong nation, and that's what fascists want. Guys, when we think about the far left, the former Soviet Union, North Korea, Cuba, the one thing that they all have in common, economically speaking, is economic failure, right? Communism as an economic system has been demonstrated to be a failure, right? The commonality between all communist states is equality of misery or poverty, right? We see poverty in those states, and China recognized that in the 1980s as a quote unquote communist state. And China actually started to embrace more elements of the free market, right? And now, I mean, China's economy is booming, right? Their economy has had 30 years of double-digit GDP growth, which is kind of amazing, right? So you could actually make a pretty strong argument that in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, the nation of China actually changed from being communist to more fascist, right? So anyways, we'll talk about that later. So guys, in a corporatist or fascist economy, right, business and government are like hand in glove, right? They work together to produce a strong economy. There's elements of private ownership, but the state oversees it heavily, right? And it says private property is allowed, but individuals may be called to use that property for the sake of the state. So I'll give you an example. In Nazi Germany, right? During the reign of Hitler and the Nazis, there's a man by the name of Ferdinand Porsche. Porsche obviously made cars, right? Porsche automobiles, but then he was called upon by the Nazis to build tanks as war became a reality for the Nazis, right? So yeah, like the state's gonna come knocking on your door and say, hey, you, Mr. Ferdinand Porsche, we need you to make tanks instead of 911 sports cars. And your answer in a fascist society is always going to be yes. Why? Because fascists will use violence in order to achieve their goals, as we talked about before, right? We looked at reactionaryism up here, okay? And guys, you have but no choice because you don't want to be killed. So yeah, corporatism, fascism is the marriage of business and the government to make the state stronger. Strong economy produces strong state. Pretty simple, right? So it is that element of private ownership that links these two sides together, right? Capitalism and corporatism / fascism. It is the element of economic equality that links the two leftist economic systems together, socialism and communism. If you know that, that's good, right? And then lastly, in the middle, in between leftist and rightist economics, we have the mixed economy. When we think mixed economy, guys, typically you think Canada. Canada is a great example of a mixed economy. And what is it? Well, it's in between socialism and capitalism. It's in between government ownership and control of industry and then a lack of government control and ownership in industry. So a mixed economy, guys, is this beautiful blend of socialist elements in society and also capitalist elements in society. It's a blend of public ownership under socialism and private ownership under capitalism. And when we talk about public-private enterprise or ownership, a mixed economy is kind of like 50-50. They have some public ownership and regulation, but there's also a free market. So there's less government intervention than in a socialist society, but there's definitely more than in a true capitalist society. And this kind of makes sense, right, guys? When we think, you know, Sweden, Canada, the United States, Sweden has a heck of a lot of government intervention. Canada has less, and the United States has even less, right? So in a mixed economy, the government controls key industries, things that are really, really important. Things like energy, things like education, things like healthcare, things like food regulation. Trying to think of other things, but they're escaping me right now. But guys, things that are critical to the functioning of a nation, that is what is controlled by government. Okay, so guys, that is the economic spectrum. It all comes down to basically how much intervention is in that economy, right? Total intervention, lots and lots of intervention, some intervention, no intervention, intervention sort of, but also free ownership, but also control, which is why fascism is weird, right? Students get fascism confused. But if you understand here, folks, that fascism is all about making the state stronger, then you get it, right? The goal of a fascist economy is to make the economy stronger, to make the state stronger. States that are strong economically are states that are strong militarily, and they succeed in war, right? I like to think of fascism as like a beehive, right? Everyone's all kind of working towards one goal, and they get kind of angry when states threaten them, and they tend to go out and sting other people, right? They tend to go to war. Okay, with that being said, guys, now we need to talk about the political spectrum, okay? So that was the economic spectrum. Now, the political spectrum, guys, it's this center purple box, and then also this orange colored line. And when it comes down to political systems in the world, guys, what we're talking about is whether or not the political system allows people to have input in the system or not, right? And let's talk about the system that allows people to have input into the system, where you're allowed to vote, where the people can become members of that government. And we're talking about democracies, right? Democratic political systems are the systems that give people say in their government. We, the people, vote for who we want to lead us, right? And guys, we find democracies in the middle of the spectrum. Okay, we find them in the middle of the spectrum. So remember earlier when we talked about Sweden as an example of a socialist state? Well, guess what? Sweden is also a democracy. In Sweden, the people get to choose their leaders, right? They get to vote in elections. I said Canada is a great example of a mixed economy. Well, it falls into that purple box in the middle. In Canada, we get to vote for who our leaders are. And then I said the United States is a great example of a nation that is a capitalist nation. And in the US, do they get to vote for their president and for their members of Congress and stuff like that, and their Senate? Absolutely, right? They get to have some say in their political system. So in the middle here, folks, is where we find democracies, okay? Now, it is on the extremes, right? Democracies in the middle, and then dictatorships on the outside. What is a dictatorship? Well, typically, guys, when we think dictatorship, we can also call them authoritarian. We can also call them totalitarian. Oh, that disappeared. And we can also call them, I apologize, we can also call them autocratic political systems, okay? So dictatorships, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, or autocratic, those all mean the same thing. If you live in a state that is a dictatorship or is an autocratic system or a totalitarian system, you live in a state, folks, where you don't get any say in who makes up your government. And we find dictatorships to be on the far left or the far right of the political spectrum, right? They're on the extremes. So democracies in the middle, and then dictatorships on the outside. And I tell you what, living in a democracy, that's good, right? Living in a democracy means we, the people, get to have some say in the decisions that are made, in the people who have control, I guess, over us. And in dictatorship, you don't, right? You don't. And I mean, when you think about the far left and communism, Joseph Stalin was in power in the Soviet Union for 29 years. When you think about the far right and fascism, Hitler was in power from 1933 to 1945. Both those nations, while Hitler or Stalin was in power, had no elections. In the modern day today, we have North Korea as an example of a far left communist dictatorship, right? And in North Korea, there are no elections, or if there are elections, then the elections are predetermined, or you're going to get ballot box stuffing where only Kim Jong-un's name is going to go in there. Right now in the world, we have the nation of Belarus, right? Belarus is one of the few remaining, or maybe perhaps the only remaining dictatorship, authoritarian dictatorship in the nation of Europe, right? There's not a lot of them left. And the reason for that is as time has gone on, people have demanded some say in their government, in their political system. And it's pretty hard for dictatorships to cling on to power today in the day and age of things like Facebook and mobilizing campaigns, social media, cell phones, YouTube, all that stuff, because nothing can be hidden anymore, right? 70 years ago when Stalin was in power, it was pretty simple to hide what was going on in the USSR from everybody. Now, it still makes the news, right? Like if you were watching the news in the summer, in Belarus, they are cracking down on anti-government protesters because in dictatorships, they don't like power to be threatened, right? Like the leader of Belarus doesn't want to see himself lose his power, his privilege, his prestige, and that title, right? Okay, so guys, that is the economic and the political spectrum. Hopefully that helps you out a little bit here. Yeah, so we'll check you later, and as always, peace. Have a good day.